to another of Pat's Chats with me, Patrick Gleason from Out of the Basement. Today I'm joined with Tim Earley from Appalachia, is it?
Yeah, I live in Western North Carolina.
Okay, yeah. And welcome aboard. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, sir.
So I know you're a poet, game designer, geek, and also
Yes,
a nature lover because I've seen all those pictures of you going out in the wilderness and that.
yes, definitely.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Just a quick geek background, if you will.
Sure. Like I said, I'm from Western North Carolina. I've lived all around the country. I'm back here now in Asheville, um, and have been for 2 years. I started gaming when I was a kid, 10 years old in
Oh, jeez.
1982.
Wow,
I
yeah.
started with the basic Dungeons and Dragons in the
Yeah.
red box, did basic and expert. Hopped over to advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I was running games in that by the time I was, I don't know, 11,
Oh,
12.
wow.
Yeah, I learned a lot of vocabulary from the advanced Dungeon Master's guide.
Yeah. Hmm.
It was a little above my reading level,
Yeah.
probably, but I jumped on it and
That's
uh,
impressive. Yeah.
I ran games for almost exclusively my brother, who was 6 years older than me,
Oh, wow.
and my cousin, who was 2 years younger.
That's a
And
wide
so,
range. That's
yeah, we had quite a age range, and I was in the middle, and we would spend the night at my grandmother's house, and often we would start playing at like 6 or 7 right after dinner, and we would play until the sun came up, you know, just obsessively, just
mm-hmm.
so into it. And, I'd have stuff prepared, but then after about midnight, I was out with whatever I prepared, and we would just, a bunch of kids sitting in the dark in a dimly lit room,
Mm-hmm.
making stuff up for hours.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
awesome. Yeah.
yeah, and so I DM from the time I was about 10 to 16, just DMing for my brother and my cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started writing. Poetry, some fiction, and I drifted away from gaming. And I didn't game again until 2016,
Oh,
and I
well.
was living. Yeah,
Because
I
usually
was
it's like I did game for a few years. You're
uh,
talking decades here.
yeah, I was from 16 to 44, I think something like that. And I had a friend in Denver, Colorado. I was living there with my wife, and she was working on her PhD in creative writing at the University of Denver. And so all the people we knew out there were poets and fiction writers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my friends out there said, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons before. I would like to do that. It's on my bucket list. And I was like, I bet I can make that happen. So I grabbed the fifth edition books and I started running for a small group out there. And then I was like, I'm really busy. I was, teaching 5, 6 classes at the time. I teach for the University of Mississippi
Mm-hmm.
online, and I have been since 2012.
Nice.
And
Yeah,
so I
that,
was
that
like,
keeps you a little busy. That just that alone.
yeah, 150 students. You're grading their discussion boards and their essays. And I said, I needed something that's a little more streamlined. So we shifted from fifth edition in the dungeon world. And I got really into Powered by the Apocalypse games and like a more narrative
Mm-hmm.
first form of storytelling and fell forward and those sort of core principles of Powered by the Apocalypse.
Yes.
And went through a lot of different iterations of that. The wrestling game, which I think is absolutely brilliant. You can't really have a bad game with that game.
Well, that
Um,
yeah, I didn't realize I knew Powered by Apocalypse had a lot because I was a grown up wrestling fan back when it was WWF still. Yeah, so
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's one. It's called a Wide World of Wrestling, I think is the name of it. But it's
okay.
absolutely brilliant. It's on its second edition now. And yeah, I grew up watching Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling when Ric Flair
Mm-hmm.
was still local to the Carolinas and before he became this huge
Huge. Yeah.
like cultural icon. I saw him play in a gym in my home near my hometown that
Oh.
probably had 250 people
Oh my
there
God. Jeez.
that night, and
Yeah.
Ric Flair was there, and he had his purple robe, and my dad got his autograph, and that was probably 1977. Um, so yeah, but that's a fabulous game. Monster of the Week is another
Hmm.
PBTA that I really loved, and I just started experimenting with the offshoots like Blades in the Dark and games like that. And I was sort of a system hopper for a while. I just wanted to try everything, learn as many different systems, and I would often in Denver have like three different games, three different campaigns going at the same time with different groups of riders. So I was, when I fell back into it after
You
28
felt
years,
it. You.
I felt deep. Yeah. And we were playing, like I was doing a Ravenloft campaign using Dungeon World.
Mhm.
Um, and at the end of it, one of my players said, you should set something in Appalachia and make a game about Appalachia. And this is probably in 2019. And I was like, that sounds like a good idea to me. Like I teach Appalachian literature at University of Mississippi. Um, I love the culture, grew up in the region. Um, and so that's when the first seed of writing Holler sort of came to me in like 2018, I think. And then I started writing it in 2019, and I discovered Savage Worlds at a convention in 2019. I played a Flash Gordon game with the creator,
Yeah.
with the writer,
Yeah.
Scott Woodard. And Daryl Hayhurst was there, who's now the creative director at Pinnacle.
Hmm.
And he was teaching me how to play. I was complete newbie to the system, and I just had a blast. I love the swingy dice and, the exploding dice
Hmm.
and the bennies flying around the table. And
Oh
I was
yeah.
just
Yes.
like,
Yes.
wow, this is fun. And so I started buying up all my Savage Worlds. East
There's.
Texas University, ran a Flash Gordon campaign, um, Deadlands. I love the Goon, which is a game that not a lot of folks play, I don't
Yeah.
think, but it's an absolutely fabulous.
I'll have to take a look at that one
Yeah.
because I've done some of the Rifts, Savage World, Deadlands. Uh, looked at Flash Gordon. Need to get a chance to play it though, but so I have to check out that one then too. The.
Yeah, they're really, really, really fun. And so that was sort of my arc from being totally into it as a kid, not into it for a long time, and then discovering it again and just falling back in love with it, sitting around the table. And everybody I was playing with was a writer. And so, that narrative collaboration was just sort of there.
Mhm.
Everyone was sort of, you know, already tuned to that and wanting to do that and excited about it. So I would say a few things and they would just pick it up and go and just really these really wonderful stories.
I always
Really
found it's nice to get that feedback from the players, like to help drive the story forward, as opposed to sort of okay, I'm sort of not railroading you, but this is how it's people go and they just react to it as opposed to helping the story change.
right, exactly. Yeah. And I felt like sometimes, you could if you get the ball rolling enough and there's enough sort of synergy, like I didn't say anything for like 30 minutes at a time. I could leave the table and go get a snack and come back and it'd still be, ripping off each other in the scene. And so those were really like highlight moments when like, you create this story, but then they pick it up and it becomes this entirely other thing. And they're not trying to like, be edge lords and take it in a
No,
weird
no, no.
direction
It's
and break
just
the game. There's just enthusiasm. That's right. You know.
okay. The question for you, because I also know you do the hiking and stuff like that.
Yeah,
And does that help you to do more, be more creative? Like, does that help get your mind in focus for doing the stories, or do you able to just disconnect completely and not think about any of the writing or anything and just enjoy the nature?
I think there is some overlap. Like I started when I moved back to North Carolina. I hadn't. This is another thing. I wasn't physically active for about 25 years either in my adult life. I was very active as a kid, and then just being a professor, you're sitting at a table all the time, you're
Hmm.
sitting in front of the computer all the time, you're just grading. And I didn't move around. And during the pandemic, I was carrying an Amazon box in, and I was like breathing heavy, going up like 8 steps. I'm like, that doesn't seem right.
No, that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem right. And so I started doing some martial arts stuff, boxing and Muay Thai, and it
Hmm.
sort of whipped me into shape. And when we moved back here, I really wanted to get back and reconnect with the landscape. So I started going hiking, and then that turned into the trail running, which is mostly what I do now, which is a really demanding sport, just beautiful sport out
Yeah.
there running in the
Well,
woods
yeah,
up
I've
the
seen some of the
mountain.
pictures. Beautiful countryside, like just incredible.
Yeah, and it's the landscape really is one of the most important things in Holler. And the land, I've always been fascinated by it since I was a kid. I grew up in the foothills, so a lot of rolling hills
Yeah.
and deep gullies, and nothing's quite completely level. But then you could look just to the west, and you see that ridge line. You know, you see the Blue Ridge Mountains right there, and the fog draped over them, and you could get there in 30 minutes, 20 minutes, and it seemed like it was so close, but it also seemed like another world. And they're ancient mountains, you know,
Yes.
and there's a sense of mystery about them, uh, and they feel magical when you're out in them. It changes every day. To get back to your question, like every day that I go running out there, I run the same trails a lot, but they look different because of the weather, the light,
Yeah.
and it's just an amazing experience. And new little plants popping up, and mushrooms, and like the different animals that you see. And I really sort of bonded with the landscape again. And it's a landscape that can very quickly look rather haunted
I,
with the fog,
well, I was
you
gonna say
know?
with the right time of light and the right type of
Yeah.
day, and you're just sort of like, do I hear
And,
something behind me?
yeah. And once fall hits, it becomes you're in the Blair Witch Project every
Yeah.
time you go run. That's what it feels like. And you get out into some pretty remote areas, and out there I've been. Well, just 2 weeks ago, I was bitten by a copperhead
Oh boy.
on a
Ooh.
run on my ankle. Last summer, I was bluff charged by a 300-pound black bear. Um, and you get out there by yourself, um, you know, miles from anybody, and your mind starts working on in that landscape, and you hear the trees creak and groan. You're like, what's around this corner? And it feeds the imagination.
Hmm.
So I tried to capture like some of that
I,
in Holler,
I
how
think
the
you did that.
landscape.
Yeah, because there's that feeling of, well, sort of isolation in some areas, and
Right.
not knowing what's happening around the bend. But there's also a lot of community in Holler too, because I mean that's important for a lot of the older communities, but you still get that sense for some areas like, okay, this is our community. We may not quite always agree with each other,
Yes.
but it's our community. And
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah.
I did see a lot of that in your book. In that, do you plan to continue more with Holler, or you're going, hey, I can do something else, or
You know, I worked on Holler really hard for 3 or 4 years, from like the original idea to like Pinnacle picking it up. And then I knew that these games involved a lot of work, but then being a part of it and just seeing all the different moving parts, all the iterations, all the play testing, all the proofreading, the art going from concept to the sketches to the final pieces, and then pulling it all together. And Pinnacle has such a talented team doing that. And I was
mm-hmm.
working with wonderful people like Tracy Sizemore. She was my project lead. So, she helped me with everything, helped with a lot of the rules, a lot of editing. Gerald Hayhurst, who came up with the idea for the moonshiner to be able to throw like combustible
Oh, okay,
liquid.
that's the okay,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was Daryl. We were playing, and that came out, and he was like, it'd be great if my moonshine was, I don't know, a fireball. So,
Sure, yeah.
yeah, sounds good to me. It makes sense. So it really became, once it went to the folks at Pinnacle, it was my vision, but it became like a completely collaborative effort. And there were a lot of different uh, voices, a lot of different creative energies. The artist, Francesco Chiappara,
Yeah.
uh, you know, has just did a wonderful job. And, and Shane would check in and see how things were going. And,
Hmm.
you know, um, and it was just awesome to work with them. Um, but after it was finished, I was like, good Lord, I need a break. I thought about Holler like
Yeah. No,
more than
it's
anything else for
mm,
3 years. I
yes.
was thinking about Holler, like, and like you can own, the different kinds of cryptids, and like how should we do this Bigfoot as opposed to all the other iterations of big feet? You know, and you find yourself thinking about these things over dinner,
It's like,
like intensely.
yeah,
And it
and
God,
having weird discussions of like, so the Bigfoot should be like this, and you,
yeah, just every little detail. And my wife Jessica, she's a writer as well. Um, she did she had a lot of these conversations, and she did some of them like archetype design with the clothes that the
oh,
characters
nice,
are wearing.
yeah,
Those ideas were hers, like the granny woman, her appearance, the gouger, her appearance. With a lot of the women archetypes,
yeah,
she had wonderful ideas. Like, no, they need to be dressed like this. And
okay,
so it was just this ongoing conversation for 3 years about Holler. So when it was in the can, I was like, I don't want to think about Holler for a while, but
yeah.
you just become so big a part of your life. But now I'm past that stage and I'm back to being excited about it. And we're cooking up some new content
Oh,
for
good,
Holler
nice,
right
nice.
now. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
That's impressive. And I was going to say it's also because I know having talked to other designers and stuff, your family and the support from your family and loved ones is so important, right? Because it doesn't get past that. Like if your wife or whatever loved one isn't supportive, it's so much harder because they don't have the understanding or the support. So your wife, I know you've been married. I had it on the tip of my tongue. My memory. You've been married for a fair amount of years now, isn't it?
yeah. We got married in Lord 2017.
Okay.
So yeah, 6 years, and then we've been together since 2014.
Yeah.
And so one day, it was so I say, Jess, I think I want to run some Dungeons and Dragons. And then I said, I think I really want to invest a lot of time into making a role playing game,
Yeah.
just out of the blue. He was like, okay, that sounds awesome. I don't know what that entails. But she was just an integral part of the whole process.
Well, that again, that
Um,
helps a lot.
yeah.
Now, how did Pinnacle pick? Like I know because you said you met the people at the Pinnacle, well, the Savage Worlds at a convention, but then how did you go about to like sell them on Holler and say, hey, I've got a game, a design for you guys. Like how did that go about the getting in touch with them and then picking them up?
Yeah, well, they have this awesome licensee program called the Aces, and it's this community of folks who, you know, they create content for
Mm-hmm.
Savage Worlds, and there's a process where you submit, a sample of
Oh,
what you're working on, and then they're like, yeah, we'll license that, full speed ahead, we'll do
okay.
it. And I did that with Holler and sent it in, and they gave me the ACES license. So I was just going to make it on my own. And with my limited knowledge of the industry and how
Yeah.
Kickstarters work, I was looking, well, I guess I'll be doing that. And then they had this big Savage cruise, like right before the pandemic started, where all these gamers on this big cruise, all these Savage Worlds games being run. And I was going to go on it and run Holler. And I had like some scheduling conflicts and family conflicts that came up, and I wasn't able to go. And Shane Hensley had signed up for that game because Shane has roots in Virginia. He lived there for a while. He has roots in Appalachia, and he was very interested in it once he heard that it was being made. And
Mm-hmm.
so he hopped in because he wanted to play. And then when I couldn't go, he says, "Well, I'll run it for you." And I was just like flabbergasted at that. I was
Yeah.
like, wow, made me incredibly nervous. He said, "Send me everything you got for the adventure you were going to run." And all, that makes you feel real vulnerable. I mean,
Well,
Shane's a
yeah.
genius at
Well, like I
this,
said, like he's been there from the beginning.
yeah,
And
yeah. And it's just like so good at it, and so such a sharp mind. And so I sent it to him. He was terrified, and then he ran it, and I guess he sort of liked something that he saw in the
mm-hmm.
materials. And when they got back from the cruise, he said, he sent me an email and said,
Mm-hmm.
let's have a Zoom meeting. And the first thing he said on the Zoom meeting is, I want to offer you a contract for Holler.
No, wow.
And we had like a 10-15 minute conversation. That was
Yeah.
it. I went and told Jess, my jaw was, you know,
I can
just,
imagine. Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
had
like,
no,
well, yes, because
I
like, oh,
mean,
Shane wants to talk to me, and you're like, oh, nervous because like, oh, how did it run? And you're just like,
yeah,
not
I thought we
sure.
were going to talk about how it went. He was going
Yeah.
to maybe be nice enough to give me some tips on what to work on and what to
Mm-hmm.
improve. And then they got the license, and then I had a lot of quick hands-on learning to do. about how to write, plot point campaign
Yeah,
and
there is a difference between like creative writing, fiction in that, and actually having to write a game itself, design a game. Like there's a lot more to it than just, oh, I'll write up some narrative stories, and that's like, no, you gotta come up with all the different scenarios and then plots and
yeah, it has to be playable. It has to
yeah.
work at the table, and the rules have to, uh, you know, lend to the action and increase the drama without weighing it down or becoming too fussy.
Mhm.
And Savage Worlds is a system that I think strikes a really good balance between um, a seamless flow of action, but you can also crunch it up a little bit.
If you need to or
You can
want to,
dial it up.
yeah,
Yeah, dial it down. Like it Savage, you can just go, oh, we're just going to do trait rolls and bennies and it'll all be fine. Or you can get down to like really tactical
yeah.
grid based combat,
Hmm.
and you can do that with any system. But Savage World it has all the tools where you can just scale up and scale down so easily.
Yeah, and I do like the
Um,
fact that well, because I have Holler, so I've added some of because I'm running a Deadlands one, and I've used some of the stuff from Holler into Deadlands. You know,
yeah,
because it just fits seamlessly. It's like you don't have to do any conversion or anything. It's like pretty much, yeah, take this stuff from Holler, throw it in. You know,
yeah. I think it's easy to carry stuff from Holler to Deadlands, from Deadlands War
yeah.
to Holler. You could do some ETU
Hmm.
Holler mashups. Like those all live in like a universe. You get something like Rifts where the power level is on a completely
Yeah,
different
it's
set, right? Yeah, but yeah, Holler and Deadlands they have a lot in common. And I tried to I read some Deadlands. I knew a lot about the history and lore of Deadlands.
hmm
But when I was writing Holler, I tried to stay as far away from Deadlands as I could because there are some, resonances
hmm
between them. Um, and there still were things that I was like, oh, that sounds a lot like Deadlands after I went back and read it. Shane beat me to like some ideas, which is not surprising. But yeah, but I think it fits well with
hmm
a lot of the other Savage World
Yeah.
settings.
Well, when you were doing the thing for Holler, did you learn some stuff about your area that you didn't know beforehand? Because as you're doing the research and everything, you all of a sudden go, "Hey, I never knew that about that area."
Absolutely, and that's with I've taught like Appalachian literature for like 6 or 8 years. A lot of my poetry is based in Appalachia, and writes and engages like some of the same things as Holler. So I'd immerse myself in sort of the folklore, the history, the culture. Um, but then with Holler, I did probably a deeper dive for Holler than I did for like teaching my Appalachian literature course at the University of Mississippi. Like it required even more research, and I did find out new things.
Yeah.
And the area I'm from, it's the culture is very Appalachian, um, and my grandparents, particularly on my mother's side, spoke just a wonderful Appalachian dialect. So I had the language in my ear from
Hmm.
day one. And we lived, they lived in the house, we lived in a trailer
Yeah.
on their land. So we were like 30 yards. They were like my second set of parents growing up. So that's the language that I grew up with. Um, and you go to graduate school, you curb your accent a little bit so you can fit in with, the smart kids
Hmm.
from the urban places and the private schools. And my 20s, you know, I tried to distance myself
Yeah.
from my background, my cultural heritage, my accent. In my 30s, that's just a switch flip. And I just did away with all that and embraced it again.
That's nice. Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, it's been interesting. I've learned a lot about it. It's been like revisiting my childhood and learning things I didn't know.
Hmm.
Like you grow up in certain areas, you don't necessarily learn about the cultural richness of the area that you're from.
No, they tend not to talk about. It's sort of in the background, but it's never actually fully discussed. Like I grew up in a small area as well, and it's just like, well, they're talked about other areas. you know.
Right, yeah. And like I feel like in the 80s, everybody was just trying to become the same Americans, listening to the same pop
Hmm.
music, watching the same TV shows,
Yes.
like the beginning of sort of this mass cultural homogenization. And you didn't want to talk about the three-fingered banjo style that was innovated in your county. Like nobody,
Yeah.
it that culture was fading away, and people wanted to be like modern
Yes.
and digital and cool
And that didn't
and
fit in with
mainstream.
the, the images of, yeah, we don't want to talk about that because that's not
Right.
the.
Like we lived on our grandfather's property. My grandfather had like these two massive gardens, grew fresh fruit and vegetables all the time, and would catch these stringers of fish. And my mother, she just wanted to buy things that were in cartons and cans from the grocery store because that's what the modern American housewife was supposed to do because that's what advertisements
Yeah.
told you to do. Get
Hmm.
this for your kids.
Yeah. You.
So we
We.
had all this wonderful food. It's like, no, Pop Tarts,
Yeah.
you
Exactly.
know.
It's like we're not getting fish that we just caught. We're gonna go to the store and buy, frozen fish sticks.
Right. We're going to get, the frozen fish fillets. So it was interesting. Like you had like, I had the stories my grandparents would tell me. I had their language. I had their cultural values. And growing up in the 80s when I was like MTV and I was all into Prince and Duran Duran and
Hmm.
REM and the Sex Pistols and like, and so this clash of cultures. Um, and, when you're going into the academic world, you don't, there's some socioeconomic levels
Yes.
and prejudices. And you're keenly aware of those if you come from a rural background or a lower socioeconomic class. People call you out about the way you talk
Well, I was gonna say,
differently.
yeah, with your accent, it'd be like, oh, and sometimes it's also like not as open, but you're like, oh, you're giving you that look of, oh, you got that accent, okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I've had multiple micro interactions that were based around that, like some way I talk or some manners thing that I didn't understand, you know. And I developed a chip on my shoulder about it, after a while.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, so um, just dealing with those different tensions, those cultural tensions. And I tried to get a sense of that conflict into the game. I mean, you have the big boys who are these like educated aristocrats from a faraway place, the city.
Hmm.
It's just sort of this monolithic city. And then the folks from the Holler who have a totally different set of cultural values and beliefs.
Now I know you're a poet as well. You've produced a few books of poetry as well, correct? Is
Yes,
it
I've
is it
written.
four or no?
I've written five. The fifth one, um, I I wrote it in 2018. It was printed, ready to be published, and I pulled it from publication at the last minute, just because um, I just didn't feel great about it being out for public consumption. They were written for a friend of mine. They were all elegies. They were written for a friend of mine,
Yeah.
a writer friend who died uh, way too young,
Yeah.
and unexpectedly. And we were very close friends, had a huge impact on me creatively. And I wrote 160 poems in the 2 months after his death. And I finished it, and I thought, oh, this is a pretty good damn book of poems. So I was excited about sending it in, and then it got accepted. And they were excited about doing the book. And then after the 6 months production process, it got to the end. And I was reading this book, and I was like, I wrote these poems for him. I didn't write them for this larger public consumption,
Yeah.
and I just decided not to publish it. So I've written five, published
Four.
four, lost four.
Okay. Did that cause an issue with your publisher when you went, no, I'm not doing that?
I, poetry press runs. The poetry world's just sort of like small cottage industry. Like the only people who read contemporary poetry are other contemporary poets. Usually, I mean
Okay.
that's the
Yeah.
entire audience.
Hmm.
And so the press run was like maybe I don't know, maybe 1,000 books, 500 books. So I bought out the press run.
Oh, okay. You just went,
So
I'll take
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah. And so I don't know if they pulped them or threw them in the ocean or recycled them or what. And I just said, I'll
pay for it and just
yep, and just don't put it out. So,
okay. Uh,
yeah.
do you play the banjo?
You know, I've tried to learn, and I've tried to learn mandolin as well,
Yeah,
and I made some middling progress on the banjo, probably less progress on the mandolin, and it's one of the great shames of my existence
yeah,
that I can't play banjo or mandolin
at all.
properly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
You just realize it.
I love bluegrass. I love old time. I I love the banjo. I love hearing,
Hmm.
unlike some folks from here, the strings from the strains of deliverance and dueling banjos.
Yeah.
You know, it moves my soul when I hear that. I
Hmm.
don't have negative connotations with it. But yeah, I wish I could.
Yeah. I was gonna say because this reminds me of the when you said dueling banjos as Kermit the Frog against Steve Martin, I think it was back in the Muppet days. They did the dueling banjos.
I know. I know.
Not saying that Kermit's a real banjo player, but it was just one of those interesting ones of that.
Yeah.
Have
There's been
you?
a lot of iterations,
Yeah.
a lot of fun
Yeah.
had with that. So,
No. So for your school, when did you introduce some of your stuff from Holler into your classes? Because for Appalachian history and that, and said, okay, you know,
yeah, I haven't really. I let my students know, like when you introduce yourself, and,
mhm,
that is something that I do. I do role
yeah,
playing game stuff, and then it's Appalachian based, and it has some synergy with um, my poems. But that's it. I don't, as a professor, I've never taught one of my own books, or I don't bring my own stuff in. I just bring in stuff that
okay,
I love about other people.
yeah,
It feels like a little too much power. Now we're going to read this
yeah,
because you're setting the entire agenda. You're giving them grades, and then you're going to make them read you.
yeah.
Some
It's
people do that, but
I just
yeah,
I have no other professor that does that. It's like here's my book. We're gonna study that. It's like
yeah,
okay,
and that's fine.
yeah.
I mean, that's a personal choice, But I've never felt I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that.
So now, is your grandfather and your grandparents were from there? Were your parents from there, like the great grandparents and great grandparents from that area as well?
Yeah, as far back as we know,
Okay.
we're from that area on both sides, and sort of mostly like Scotch Irish, some German
Yeah.
ancestry.
All right. So
Um,
give me a story from back one of your grandparents or great grandparents sort of idea. Just a quick rundown of something that happened back in those days that still resonates with you nowadays. It's sort of like either a moral of a story or you're like, this is really Appalachian. Let me tell you a story.
boy, um,
Throwing you on the spot
well,
there.
yeah, yeah. A lot of stuff comes to mind. I'm trying to think what I won't get in trouble with my mom for telling. I'll tell you something I found out during, and I don't. This sounds bad because I don't want to say, "Oh, it's violence, Appalachia," but
Yeah, it's
the story itself, and then my mother's reaction
yeah.
to the story is a pretty good sort of indicator of some of the cultural values in that area.
All right.
So I was doing some research, and I was always fascinated. My mother had a great uncle. His name was Amarine, Almarine.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some really interesting names on that side of the family. And Amarine was an interesting name to me. So I was like, wonder what Amarine Jones did. And so I was doing some research. I found an incident at Cliffside Filling Station down by the river. This would have happened in the early 1940s. And there was an incident in which Amarine Jones and two of his cousins, his first cousins,
Yeah.
were matching coins, which is sort of like a game of chance, a gambling game. Turn over the
Oh,
coin,
okay.
one thing
Yeah.
or the other,
Yeah.
and you're betting on it.
Mm-hmm.
With a gentleman named Newell Pearson, and some sort of dispute happened between Newell and Amarine, his two first cousins, and it ended with Newell being hit in the head with a 2x10. And then Amarine, Lord, I can't believe I'm telling this story. Sorry, Mom. Stabbed him in the neck, stabbed him with the jugular vein, and he bled out. And they all knew each other. And
Yeah.
once they realized that he was, very badly wounded after this altercation, they rushed him to the hospital. He died, right?
Yeah.
Um, Amarine was put on trial. It was he was found innocent. I don't know if it was self-defense or what. It seemed like he was the guy, but with small town politics, his mom and dad ran a store down there that was
Yeah.
sort of central to the community, and they had their profile in that community. So I find this out. My mom never told me that this great uncle, who was her favorite great uncle, I knew, and she talked about in loving and endearing terms. She never told me he killed somebody or allegedly
It
killed
allegedly
somebody.
killed someone. Yes.
And I called her and it was like, Mama, uh, I was just reading. I found online this news story. Amarine stabbed a man when he was 24. It says in the paper, and that man died. And she said, Tim, don't talk like that about your great uncle. And I was like, well, is it true? And I read her the story, and she says, yes, I may have heard something about that. Right? And,
You sort of
you
figure this is
know,
one of those things that you sort of it was like maybe comes up in a conversation before you find out, and then
right. And there's lots of things like that. Both sides of my family. That I found out things that just sort of astonish me,
hmm
but that no one ever talked about.
yeah,
Um, so that's one that sort of struck me when I was doing the research. There's another like family um, myth we had on my dad's side of the family that sort of terrified me as a child and may be the reason that I wrote Holler. My grandmother had a house that had dual chimneys, and there was a passageway that connected them. And so it was an old house too. It was like really, really old. And those chimneys were like scary looking, real sooty and dark. And there was this family story that this fella named Mr. McGillicuddy lived in the chimney. And he would go back and forth.
yeah,
And Mr. McGillicuddy may have been some relation to us, but something had happened. His brain had gone to seed. Uh, and so he's gone mad
yeah,
was the idea and retreated into the chimney and now lived there. And Mr. McGillicuddy, he there's no that he ate children. He subsisted off children. So we were told he lived there with these long teeth,
yeah.
and he would get you. And so that resulted in the older cousins terrorizing the
The
younger
younger,
cousins.
yeah,
They would run you down, chase you, catch you, and thrust your head up into that blackness of that chimney,
yeah.
saying Mr. McGillicuddy and calling for Mr. McGillicuddy to come down.
Oh, that would
And
scare the crap out of you
yeah,
as a
it
kid.
did.
Yeah,
It did. We'd be screaming and running, and and the adults talked about it, and like, so that's something that I didn't forget. And that was just like a little family generated myth. I don't know who told that story first, put them up in the chimney.
yeah,
Somebody did. Then all the adults just sort of collectively bought into it
yeah,
and reinforced it, and the kids did. And then we would tell stories about them,
yeah.
just made up completely out of thin air, just because we had this idea that this madman lived
hmm
in the chimney. So it's like the anti Santa Claus,
yeah.
I guess, or evil Santa Claus.
But it sort of like became
Um,
a myth, like a legend myth around the area of.
yeah, and just like within our extended family, like
Yeah,
maybe like 50, 60 people in the world,
would know that one.
right? But there was this rich lore around that figure. And you could go to a lot of families,
And
right?
it have
And get
similar sort
stories
of
like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
That
You
actually
have
be.
stories.
You
Go
should
ahead.
have you thought about writing a book about that though? Like just of like going to the round and just asking people for family stories and stuff and sort of publishing it as a
I have. And one of the first things I did when we moved here, I got this really fancy voice recorder, and I was thinking of just going back to my home county and talking to folks, partially about the textile mill history
yeah.
and how which dominated the county for 100 years, and they closed down and moved away, and those very vibrant communities uh, that were produced by the textile mills just sort of disappeared. Like places that were just thriving when I was a kid,
Yeah.
Cliffside, Avondale, Henrietta, Caroline, they just really don't exist anymore. They're just ruins and abandoned houses.
Yeah.
it's really grim. So I wanted to go and recover some of that oral history, which some other folks have done too. But I knew some folks,
Mm.
and I knew I would get good stories. And then I wanted to just go up in the hills and talk to folks. I haven't found the time to do that, but it's something that I'm still thinking about. I record when I go visit my family. I say let's talk about stories, and I record
Yeah.
those conversations because I wish I had my grandmother's voice on tape. Right,
Yes.
I got
Yeah.
my mother's,
Hmm.
and there's echoes of my grandmother's voice and my mother's voice, and I have my father's. But yeah, it's just fascinating to me.
Well, and it's also,
Um,
I think it's important to keep that sort of history alive. You know, because I never really knew my grandfather, and I never, but if someone had written down some of the stories or anything, it'd sort of be a connection. It's like, okay, that's what my grandfather was like, and my grandmother never wanted to really talk about him too much. And it was just one of
right.
those ones like, I'd like to have known those sort of stories and heard them, you know.
No, I think it's vitally important for the community and like we didn't even have like the cultural knowledge. Like I didn't know growing up in these textile mill communities that there were strikes in the 30s for these textile mills.
Yeah,
Nobody
talked about them.
ever talked about it. Or that like one of the great martyrs of the American labor movement, Ella Wiggins, was killed in Gastonia, which is the mill community just a
Yeah,
little further to the east. It's more out in the Piedmont. But you just don't hear these things. There's a rich history there.
yeah, because
And people are informed by that history, whether they're aware of the history or not. And so they're recovering it. It's
I was gonna say that to be another interesting time period, like the 30s and 40s. There, I mean, interesting and sort of there was so much happening, but like the labor unrest and all that would sort of be an interesting sort of perspective as well for a game system. I think,
yeah,
especially with like a little bit of horror mixed in there as well. Yeah.
yeah. And we the in Holler, sort of, you're trying to put together this coalition to fight back
Yeah.
against the mill owners and the coal mine operators and that sort of thing. Um, and it does fit in with the horror genre really well because
Yeah.
some of those practices were industrial practices during that time were pretty brutal.
Yes.
You know, the horror stories of their own. And I knew folks who, were working there in the 80s and 90s who would lose fingers.
Yeah.
I had friends who worked in the textile mill after they got off out of high school and they go in there. And like I worked a couple of summers, it was as a heat valve factory, and I would get my fingers ground up every night on the same machine and come
Yeah.
out bleeding every single night. And people and earlier they would lose their scalps in the loom. Their hair would
Ooh.
get caught
Yeah.
and it would
Ouch.
just pull their scalp right off. And folks would lose limbs. And then in textile mills you didn't have black lung, but you had brown lung. And there's just a host of potential hazards.
Yes.
You drive by when these places were thriving, 120 days without a lost time accident. They would have a sign up.
Yeah.
That's how safe we are. So that makes you think what's going on that
Hmm.
sign is
Hit the big
uncomfortable.
huge thing. Look how many days we haven't had someone die or lose a limb or something.
Right.
You know.
And then, the persistent use injuries were even bigger than that, where so many people had like back issues and
Yeah. Yeah.
arthritis and those sorts of things. And then, you know, what comes out of that with the prescription pill use or
Yes.
using alcohol to allay symptoms.
That was
And
yeah, because that was before it was alcohol. Because I grew up on a farm, and I've seen a lot of people, back injuries, leg injuries, losing parts of their fingers, or all sorts of machinery and all that thing, and people just don't realize how dangerous it was.
yeah,
And it just, but like I said, I've read some of the stuff in the the coal mine areas and stuff like that, and just like how they were treated and the coal mine towns. The idea of like the owner owns everything. You
mhm,
get paid in script.
right,
You have to buy you buy goods at the store in script. You
mhm,
rent the house in script, but you're not being paid any real money.
right. It's like a closed economic system.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was the barber for the textile mill. He was the company barber for a while.
Oh no.
And like that's the only place you could get a hot shower was at the barber shop, and you pay for a hot shower. The other mill houses they had running water, but it wasn't hot water,
Yeah.
and that's where you get a hot shower. Um, but yeah, and so you're paying rent on your house to the company that's paying you your paycheck, and
Yes.
yeah, and my mother grew up. She grew up in the mill village. She was until they were 12 or 13. I think she
Yeah.
was 12 or 13. They lived there, and then they moved out. And that system sort of broke down in the 1950s. But those houses were still there,
Yes.
and some of them still are. And they're laid out on the grid, and you can see where the village was.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Um,
do you have any words of advice for any new, trying to become a new game designer for anyone? Like, anything out there you'd be like, don't do this. Like any ones you can say, don't do this.
um, I don't know about don't I mean don't fall too in and this is probably gets said all the time. Don't fall too in love with your world building. Don't get too caught up on those little details,
Okay.
which can turn into many, 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 many minute details. And if you think too much about like, well, you know, what's this particular area of the map is going to be like, and what's their culture, and how do they eat, what kind of fish do they catch, and what kind of clothes do they wear, and what their preferences enjoy. You
You'll
can
never
spend
stop.
your entire life doing it,
Yeah.
right? And try to write something that you can play. Try to write something that you can bring to the table. It might just be enough for a 2 hour session, right?
Right.
And start with it's just like when the GM is building a campaign world, which is the
Mm-hmm.
old solid advice. Start with this town
Yeah.
and build out from
Build
there.
out
Like
from there.
start with something that you can play, a runnable session
Mm-hmm.
where you have just enough of the mechanics and the setup that it works, and then start to tell a story and see where it goes.
Yeah.
And try to write playable material.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And I also know from DMing for years, keep notes. Keep because again, like you said, you can start with one small area, but as long as you keep notes, you can always build upon that. As you develop. You're like, oh yes, well back in this is what happened there, so I can use that to you know go forward.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like just opening yourself up to like all sorts of influences that might feed the project that
Yes.
might not seem like this doesn't have to be like games, like movies, music, history, just
Mm-hmm.
anything you can find that could give you a kernel or excite your brain or get you going in a new direction. Anything that can feed the project, just try to soak it all in
So
because you don't know how you're going to take that. Your brain's going to transmute how it's going to come out. Like it could be the thing.
mm.
Like I watched so many really bad B movies um,
They're
that
fun
had
though.
some
They're fun.
there's so much fun that has some sort of Appalachian connection. And Holler became, as it went along, it became pulpier and it
Okay.
became a little more lighthearted and infused with sort of a folk humor and
Mm-hmm.
a dark humor. Um, and I think it was a lot of watching the
So how
B
about the
films.
Army of Darkness? There is that one up there at the list?
Yes, it is. It is. And Pumpkinhead, I just love Pumpkinhead. I think it's fantastic. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I watch it there's a certain number of horror films that I watch every single fall, regardless. Pumpkinhead is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
The Witch
Yeah.
is another. Werner Herzog's Nosferatu,
Oh.
his version of Nosferatu,
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
The Wicker Man.
Wicker Man.
Uh,
Not the
I,
Nicolas Cage one, eh?
no, it's the first one. The first one, The Blood on Satan's Claw. I love the British folk horror films. I
Yes.
can't get enough of those.
I was gonna say though,
Uh,
although the Nicolas Cage one has its own sort of charm.
well, it has to having Nicolas Cage. It brings a little something, just by his presence.
Yeah.
Um,
I've always told people I like B movies or sometimes more than big production because they're
yeah,
forced to work with okay we don't have money for all the special effects or all this so we have to make it work so the story I find usually has to be tighter usually in those movies because
hmm
that's what's actually making the movie is the story you know
yeah, and there's usually a lot more raw energy and just weird stuff. They
hmm
do weird stuff, whether it's based out of expediency and this is the only thing we can do
yes
with the budget and this scene and this amount of time, or just weird things happen and they're like, okay, leave that in. What
Mhm.
does it matter?
Yeah
And yeah, I love them as well. I watch them just raw, and I love to watch. They talk about my nerd bona fides, like Mystery Science Theater 3000,
Oh
Riff
yes,
Tracks. I've consumed
yes.
hours and hours and hours and hours of
It's just
that.
one you just enjoy. And there's another one I like on YouTube called "So Bad It's Good," which basically the same idea. Is like they're watching bad '80s movies and just making fun of them. But again, they also realize they still made a movie, right? Like that's
Yeah,
the other thing too. I got to give credit, even though it's a bad movie, they still accomplished something that most
yeah,
people
and
haven't. Like,
right, yeah, absolutely. And sometimes in those films, there's just such a, a primal base engagement with like sort of large themes in
mhm.
these very broad strokes that they're just more affecting and visceral, and they actually end up saying something pretty profound through that really direct engagement with sort of broad stroke.
Yeah,
You know, sometimes nuance is just nuance
yeah.
and doesn't go, right?
uh, and
Uh,
again, like, since most Hollywood's like it is big business, right? So
right.
there is the formula, and
It's
again,
more sanitized. Yeah.
it's more sanitized. I mean, from a business perspective, I get where they're coming from. It's multi-billion dollars, so they know what formula works. But that's where the independents, the B movies, will try things that okay, well, we'll do something different, and it's so refreshing to sort of look at that and go, oh yes, okay. I'll laugh at how bad how some of the production
Mhm.
is, but I'll still enjoy it.
Yeah, and then if you take sort of that B movie ethos and apply it to your creative work,
Yeah.
I found it to be very freeing. Like you can just, yeah, dumb stuff can happen, weird things can happen. You can take something to like an absurd level,
Yes.
and it's all good.
Mhm.
Particularly coming from an academic background and a literary background, where there's this notion like there's literary fiction, and then
Yes.
there's genre fiction, there's great literature, and then there's this stuff over here,
Yes.
and just having to sort of like dismantle those hierarchies that have been, sort of suggested to me through my
Hmm.
education. Um, it was a bit of a process
Yeah.
in,
Well, it's
in
like how
itself.
come Mary Shelley Frankenstein is considered a literary classic, but Harry Harrison's Make Room isn't. But
Yeah,
Make Room deals with a lot of social issues as well. You know.
absolutely.
And
And even like within like the work of like authors who are considered literary writers, who are considered great writers, I'm thinking of like Cormac McCarthy, who recently passed away. He gets a ton of
oh, where it is?
attention for his Western novels, like
Yes.
Blood Meridian, which they say, oh, it's like the 20th century Moby Dick. It's
Yeah.
put on a pedestal. His first four novels were set in Appalachia, and two of them are essentially, you can make an argument that they're genre novels or they're horror novels.
Yeah.
Outer Dark, which is a very fabulous novel about a brother and sister, has a journey motif in it. Has some of the best descriptions of Appalachian landscape that I've ever read. And McCarthy maybe has the best ear for Appalachian dialect
Ooh,
that I've ever read. And that's not the first thing people think. They think about The Road or No Country for Old Men, the
yes.
film
Exactly. Yeah.
versions, or the Western stuff. And then Child of God is an incredibly powerful, lean, effective novel about a serial killer and necrophile who was stalking the mountains of Tennessee. And McCarthy writes it in such a way that he forces you into this sort of uncomfortable perspective of being like, yeah, Lester Ballard's a pretty interesting guy. And you don't empathize with his actions,
Yeah.
but you have to acknowledge his existence, and he becomes sort of like the man versus man protagonist and the man versus nature protagonist, of the sort of the darkest form of anti-hero
Hmm.
uh, you can possibly imagine. And McCarthy is, of course, doing this very mischievously and perversely and
Yeah.
turning the screw. And he asks at a certain point, isn't he a child of God, much like yourself?
Oh.
And
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
like, Peter, think about the ways in which you have things in common with Lester Ballard, serial killer.
Yeah.
And he just does it in a really like way. And these are McCarthy novels that are probably not held
In the
in
same
as high
esteem.
esteem as much of his later work. But for me, it's where he really gets it
Nailed
in a
it.
very
Yeah.
raw, visceral, and
I'll have
just
to check.
wonderful way.
I'll have to check that one out. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Outer Dark, Child of
Oh
God.
God. Okay.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
one more. Well,
sure.
Justified. Did you ever watch the TV series Justified with Tim the Elephant?
Yes, I have watched Justified. It was just sort of the pacing of it, the energy of it, the
How did you think they captured the sort of that sort of rural back? I don't want to say backwaters, but you know what I mean, like that sort of
yeah.
feel. Did they capture it well enough? Do you think, or is it more Hollywoodized
Well,
version
I
of
mean,
what?
there's always like a little Hollywood sheen to it, but I feel like some of the energy of the characters and the sort of the chaotic nature of the characters, and um, I think I'd like the show. I thought it was a good representation.
Right.
And sometimes I feel like, when you're talking about Appalachia or the larger South, I lived in Alabama and Mississippi a lot too, and
Yeah.
like I consider myself a Southerner just as much as you know an Appalachian. Um, Sometimes people get a little queasy about certain depictions, and particularly when there's violence or there's substance abuse, and you're being reductive, you're reducing the culture to
Mm-hmm.
these negative aspects of the culture. But I think it's important to keep engaging the aspects that the artist sees and the artist has experienced,
Mm-hmm.
um, and not just not engage those things for politeness, political correctness, so we can all feel better about the shape that the culture
Yeah.
is in. Yes, there are many, many, many different aspects to it, and that slice of it is constantly changing. It's not one thing, and it's just one small slice,
Yeah.
but it's a slice that
You
if
still
you're
have to
exposed to
you
it,
still have to recognize and understand. You can't just
absolutely,
yeah.
you can't ignore it. You
Mm-hmm.
can't like just in my personal experience, like when your next door neighbor who happens to sell drugs, who's happened to assault multiple people, who has attacked every member of his family, comes knocking on your door enraged at 3 o'clock in the morning because he can't get his pills. You might write about that if you
Yes.
write poems. And if you're from that area and you write about that, you're going to automatically have from some circles, academic circles, like, oh, that's a stereotypical depiction of people from this area, and it's reinforcing these negative cultural stereotypes. You know, okay,
but but look deeper. Look deeper
that's a
in.
larger conversation
Yeah, but
we
look
can
deeper.
have.
And yeah,
Yeah,
I don't want to get into the social economic things of. There's
yeah,
usually other reasons for substance abuse and everything besides
sure,
just that. And that's where sometimes like the news media and that sort of overlooks that sort of thing. Is like, oh, he was a drug user. Well, why? Like there's usually more to it, but people don't want to get too in depth, and it's like just want the quick news item of like, oh, junkie killed 4 people.
right, right. And there's complex histories, and the person like I was referencing was a friend of mine, and had a very complex history, and was a complex
Mm-hmm.
human being, and had tons of like potential and tons of things he wanted to do. But there were a lot of factors that were keeping him from doing those things,
Mm-hmm.
not many of which were his fault.
No, well,
you know,
yeah,
yeah,
and yeah,
there's
it's
always a negotiation there, but yeah, and I think that's the challenge, like to show those things with their full complexity
mm-hmm.
and the full range of humanity that attends those kinds of problems, and not just saying, well, this is another example of these errant, unfortunate, benighted souls who
Yes.
inhabit this region. There's
Well,
there's room for all of
yeah, I was gonna say, I imagine when you're growing like not when you're growing up, but when you left, you had some of that stereotype coming towards you, as you said, when you're trying to be, I'm not that. I'm changing my culture. I'm more modern. Because I'm sure part of that was because you're getting that influx of the stereotypes towards you of, oh
it.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. And my response to it initially was to try to distance myself. And then my next phase response to it was trying to put it in people's faces. And hopefully I'm in the place now, maybe not, I don't know, where I'd have a little more, equanimity about it and
Yeah.
generosity and geniality about it, and it
Mhm.
can be a more neutral
Yeah. It's
kind
just
of thing.
it's
So,
there. Yeah.
yeah, it is what it is. Yeah,
If you're not willing to look more into it than just that, well, I can't change you.
right,
And so,
right.
well, thank you very much, Tim. This has been great. Again, I always love talking to people and this sort of thing. I just wish we could have a beer together.
Oh yeah.
Do you ever go to Gen Con or anything?
I haven't been to Gen Con. I would go to Genus Con out in Denver when I was out there.
Okay.
I may go to Gen Con in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to get back. I just sort of stopped going to conventions once COVID happened, and I haven't
Yes.
started back. But I would like to. I really enjoy them. So yeah,
Yeah.
I hope we get to have a beer sometime.
I'm trying to get to Gen Con next year because it's just one of those ones like there's so many happening. You're just sort of you got to sort of go which ones can I do economically
Right,
and time.
exactly. They are
Um,
expensive.
but yeah, like I said, I'm gonna try and get a hold of Shane as well for an interview. And one of these days, if you guys are all together, let me know like you guys are hey, we're getting a reunion. I'll come down and buy you guys some beer.
Okay, okay,
I'll,
yeah, that sounds great.
and I'll bring you Canadian whiskey. Are you a whiskey fan or
I
bourbon?
do drink. I will drink some whiskey
Okay. I'll bring you some good Canadian
on
stuff.
on occasion. Awesome. That sounds great.
I'm just hang on there for a second, Tim, because what I'm going to do now is
Sure.
just do a break, and I'll just come back quickly there. All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you very
Sure.
much, Tim, for joining us, and thank you everyone for watching this great interview. I'll put links in the video for all Tim's novel, poems, and everything, so you'll be able to check it out there.